The prairie had always seemed wide and endless to little Mary Beth, but never had it felt so empty as the day her father was lowered into the ground. The spring wind carried with it the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers, yet to Mary Beth everything smelled of loss. She clutched the hem of her faded dress, watching as neighbors and townsfolk gathered around the small wooden coffin. Her father, Thomas Callahan, had been a kind man, a hard-working ranch hand who had never owned much more than his horse, his tools, and a heart brimming with love for his daughter. Mary Beth had no memory of her mother. She had passed away in childbirth. Her father had been both mother and father to her, carrying her on his shoulders after long days of labor, teaching her how to skip stones in the creek and whispering stories about the stars at night. He wasn't wealthy, but in his presence, Mary Beth had always felt richer than any child with fine dresses and silver spoons. Now, standing beside the grave, Mary Beth felt as though someone had stolen the very sun from the sky. She was 9 years old, too young to understand the way death crept quietly into a man's lungs and took him in the middle of the night, too young to grasp why the world carried on as if nothing had changed when her own had crumbled into dust. Her stepmother, Lydia Callahan, stood stiff and expressionless beside her. Lydia had married Thomas only a year before his death, a widow herself who saw in him a stable man to keep her secure. But with Thomas gone, the mask of civility cracked, revealing her disdain for the child she had never truly accepted. She did not hold Mary Beth's hand at the graveside, did not offer her comfort, did not shed a single tear. When the service ended, neighbors murmured their condolences, some casting sympathetic glances toward the girl. A few whispered their concerns. Poor child, what will become of her? But none dared voice them aloud in front of Lydia. After all, the law was clear. The girl belonged to her stepmother now. That evening, in the dim light of their modest cabin, Mary Beth sat silently in the corner, hugging her father's old hat to her chest. It was too large for her small frame, the brim nearly swallowing her face, but it smelled of him, of leather, sweat, and wood smoke. She buried her nose in it, trying to memorize every trace. Lydia, meanwhile, busied herself with accounts and complaints. "Your father left nothing," she snapped, slamming shut a ledger. "No land, no savings, just debts and this tiny roof over our heads. Do you think I can keep both of us on scraps? You'll have to earn your keep." Mary Beth didn't answer. She had no words, only tears she fought to hold back. Her father had told her, only days before his coughing worsened, "Don't let the world harden your heart, little bird. You're stronger than you know." She repeated those words silently now, clinging to them like a lifeline. The days that followed were harder still. Where once her father's presence had shielded her, she now felt the sharp edge of Lydia's resentment in every command, every cold glance. Tasks that had been chores shared with her father became punishments under her stepmother's rule. Still, Mary Beth tried to remain brave. Each night, she whispered a prayer at her bedside, asking God to watch over her father's soul and to give her the strength to face another day. And though she could not know it yet, her prayer was already in motion. Far beyond the hills and rivers, a man named Caleb Montgomery, wealthy rancher, solitary but kind, was tending to his cattle and feeling a stirring in his heart that his life was missing something. Fate was already weaving their paths together. Though Mary Beth, clutching her father's hat in the darkness, believed herself utterly alone. Life under Lydia's roof soon became a chain of endless burdens for Mary Beth. What had once been a modest but loving home, warmed by her father's laughter, turned into a place of cold commands and sharp silences. Lydia wasted no time in showing the girl that kindness had died with her father. At dawn each morning, before the sun had even broken the horizon, Lydia would shake Mary Beth awake with a harsh whisper. "Up! There's wood to chop and water to fetch. Don't think you can laze about just because you're a child." Mary Beth, her body still small and frail, rubbed the sleep from her eyes and rose without complaint. She learned quickly that complaints earned her nothing but scorn. The chores were endless. She carried buckets of water from the creek, her thin arms trembling under the weight. She scrubbed laundry until her knuckles were raw, kneaded bread while her stomach growled and swept the dusty floors only to be told she had missed a corner. Her stepmother's voice, cold and sharp, seemed to echo around her. "Do it again. Do it right this time." Food, once shared warmly at the table with her father, became another weapon Lydia used against her. The woman would heap her own plate, with potatoes and salted pork, leaving Mary Beth with crusts of bread or a thin ladle of watery broth. "Be grateful," Lydia would snap when Mary Beth's eyes lingered too long on the food. "A roof over your head is more than you deserve." Neighbors sometimes passed by, catching glimpses of Mary Beth hauling water or kneeling in the garden under the hot sun, her face pale with exhaustion. A few pitied her, but Lydia's tongue was sharp, and she knew how to keep others at a distance. "The girl needs discipline," she would say loudly, as if rehearsing a line. "Spare the rod, spoil the child, as the good book says." Folks nodded uneasily and moved on, unwilling to interfere. At night, when Mary Beth's body ached from the long day, she found her only comfort in her father's old hat, hidden beneath her blanket. She would trace the brim with her small fingers, whispering to herself, "Papa, I'll try to be strong. I'll try to make you proud." The memory of his gentle hand on her shoulder was enough to keep her tears quiet until she fell asleep. But Lydia's cruelty wasn't only in the chores or the hunger. It was in her words, which cut deeper than any whip. She delighted in reminding Mary Beth that she was unwanted. "Your own mother left you," she sneered once, "and now your father's gone. I'm all you have, and don't you forget it." The words lodged in Mary Beth's heart like thorns, but she swallowed them down, too afraid to speak back. Despite everything, there was a resilience in Mary Beth's spirit that Lydia could not crush. When sent to the creek, she would pause for a moment to watch the sunlight dance on the water. When left in the fields, she would hum a song her father once sang. She clung to the small, quiet joys around her, wildflowers blooming by the path, the distant call of meadowlarks, the warmth of the sun on her face. These tiny sparks reminded her that the world still held beauty, even if her life was filled with shadows. What Mary Beth could not see, however, was that Lydia's heart was hardening further. The woman's debts were growing, and she began to see Mary Beth less as a burden to discipline and more as a problem to solve. She wanted freedom, and in her mind, freedom meant ridding herself of the child once and for all. For Mary Beth, the cruelty of home was not the end, but only the beginning of the storm. The true test of her spirit was yet to come, on a lonely trail where even the sky seemed to abandon her. Lydia Callahan had never been a woman with much patience, and less so now that her late husband's debts loomed over her like gathering storm clouds. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, the ledger book open before her, lips pursed as she tallied numbers that refused to add up. A few neighbors had grown suspicious about her mounting requests for credit at the general store, and whispers were beginning to follow her in town. Every glance felt like judgment. Mary Beth, meanwhile, was on the floor by the hearth, mending a torn hem on one of Lydia's dresses with clumsy stitches. Her small hands fumbled with the needle, pricking her finger, but she didn't dare cry out. Lydia's sharp eyes flicked toward her once, narrowing at the uneven stitches before returning to the numbers in the ledger. The more Lydia stared, the more one thought grew roots in her mind. The girl was an anchor weighing her down, a useless mouth to feed, a constant reminder of her own foolish choice to marry Thomas Callahan, who had promised more than he left behind. With each passing day, resentment turned into calculation. That night, when Mary Beth finally drifted into sleep on her thin cot, Lydia sat awake, candlelight throwing long shadows across the room. She tapped her fingers against the table, thinking. There was talk in town of opportunities further west, whispers of fortunes to be made if one had the freedom to travel light. Freedom, she thought, was something she deserved. And freedom would never come with a child dragging at her skirts. The decision was made as coldly as one might decide to toss out an old pair of shoes. Lydia would leave the girl behind. Not in town, where neighbors might interfere, but out on the trail, where no one could accuse her of wrongdoing. "It's the Lord's will," she muttered to herself, convincing her heart of the lie. "The girl was never meant to be mine." Next day, Lydia was sharper than usual, her commands clipped. She told Mary Beth to gather her few belongings. "We're moving west. There's no life here for us anymore." Mary Beth's eyes lit up with the faintest spark of hope. A journey meant new places, perhaps a chance for better days. She packed, carefully, her father's hat, a small comb, a scrap of ribbon, and a worn Bible he had once read to her from. For the first time in months, she dared to dream that maybe her life might change for the better. She didn't notice the hard gleam in Lydia's eyes as the woman harnessed the horse to the wagon. The trail was rough and dusty, winding between hills and stretching into endless plains. Mary Beth tried to keep up cheer, humming softly to herself, asking timid questions about where they were going. Lydia gave no answers. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her thoughts already far ahead, imagining herself unburdened. By midday, Lydia stopped the wagon near a shallow creek. "Fetch water," she ordered, thrusting a bucket into Mary Beth's hands. Grateful for the break, the girl hurried down to the water's edge, kneeling to dip the bucket. The coolness on her hands brought her a fleeting smile. But when she turned back, her heart stopped. The wagon was moving, slow at first, then faster as Lydia snapped the reins. Dust rose in the air, the sound of hooves carrying her stepmother further and further away. Mary Beth dropped the bucket, water splashing into the dirt. She ran, calling out, "Wait! Please wait!" Her small legs pumped with all their strength. But the wagon grew smaller with each desperate step. Her cries echoed across the empty plain, unanswered. Lydia did not look back. And just like that, Mary Beth was alone, abandoned on a trail where the sun beat mercilessly down and the land stretched endless in every direction. She stood trembling, her father's hat clutched against her chest, the dust of her stepmother's departure settling around her like a cruel curtain. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth realized that she was utterly forsaken, not just unloved, but discarded. Still, somewhere deep inside, a tiny ember of resolve flickered. She whispered through her tears, "Papa, I'll be strong. I won't give up." The sun was unrelenting, a white blaze overhead that made the horizon shimmer as if the whole world were melting. Mary Beth stood frozen for a moment after the wagon disappeared, her chest heaving, her throat raw from calling out. A silence settled around her, so complete, so heavy, that it seemed the earth itself had swallowed her cries. The bucket lay tipped on its side near the creek, water soaking into the thirsty dirt. Mary Beth's legs finally gave out, and she sank, to her knees. For a few moments, she couldn't even weep. Shock held her in its grip. Her stepmother had truly gone, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hat pressed to her chest. She wanted to believe it was a mistake, that Lydia would return, that maybe the wagon had only gone ahead for some reason. But the longer she stared down the dusty trail, the clearer it became. No one was coming back for her. Mary Beth rose unsteadily, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her father had often told her stories of the prairie, warning her of its dangers. Coyotes roamed at night, rattlesnakes slithered in the tall grass, and beyond that, there was the simple, merciless fact of nature. Without water and shelter, a person could not last long. Her small hands gripped the bucket again, though she knew it would be of little use. She knelt at the creek, filling it halfway and sipping greedily, the water cool against her parched throat. She splashed some onto her face, washing away the dust and tears, then sat back on her heels. She was only 9. Yet in that moment she felt older, as if the burden of survival had aged her overnight. The trail stretched in both directions, offering no hint of safety. Should she follow where the wagon had gone, or turn back toward the town they had left behind? Her heart urged her to chase after Lydia, to cling to the faint hope that her stepmother might relent. But her mind, small and scared though it was, told her the truth. Lydia had abandoned her on purpose. There was no going back, so Mary Beth chose forward. She adjusted her father's hat on her head. It wobbled, far too large, but shaded her face from the sun. With the bucket sloshing at her side, she started walking. Each step stirred up puffs of dust that clung to her bare ankles. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the trail, a lonely companion. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and Mary Beth's small frame began to sway under the heat. Her lips cracked. The bucket grew heavier with each mile, until she finally set it down, and carried only the hat, clutching it to her chest like a shield against fear. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but she pressed on, whispering to herself with each step. Papa said I'm strong. Papa said I can endure. As the day dragged into late afternoon, the land seemed to change. The trail grew rockier, the grasses sparser. A hawk circled high above, its cry piercing the silence, making her shiver. She stumbled more than once, catching herself on scraped palms, but she always got back up. She knew if she stopped too long, she might never rise again. By evening, the sky turned shades of orange and purple, the sun sinking behind distant hills. Mary Beth collapsed beside a cluster of scrubby bushes. The air cooled, but with the night came new dangers. The eerie howls of coyotes echoing across the plains, the rustle of unseen creatures in the grass. Fear gripped her, yet exhaustion pressed heavier. Curling into herself, she pulled her father's hat over her face like a blanket and whispered a trembling prayer. God, please, don't let me die here. Send me someone. Please. The stars began to blink awake overhead, ancient witnesses to the little girl's struggle. Somewhere far down the trail, a lone horse's hooves struck the ground in steady rhythm. Though Mary Beth didn't yet know it, help was already on its way, carried by a man who had no idea that fate was leading him straight toward a child who needed him more than anyone ever had. The prairie at night was not the gentle hush of bedtime stories Mary Beth's father used to tell. It was alive with sounds that pierced the silence and wrapped around her like a cloak of dread. From her small resting place beside the thorny bushes, she could hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, each one sounding closer than the last. The tall grass rustled as if something moved just beyond sight, and the wind carried a low whistle that made the hairs rise on her arms. Mary Beth hugged her knees to her chest, clutching her father's hat so tightly that the brim bent under her fingers. Her heart pounded like a drum inside her thin rib cage. She tried to remember what her father had once told her about the prairie at night. Most creatures are more afraid of you than you are of them. Keep your wits about you, little bird, and the night will pass. But without him there, those words felt like whispers from another life, almost too far away to reach her. The stars were brilliant above her, spread wide across the velvet sky. She found comfort in them, trying to pick out the constellations her father had taught her. Orion with his belt, the Big Dipper pointing toward the North Star. If she could follow the stars, perhaps she wouldn't feel so lost. The thought steadied, her trembling just enough to close her eyes for a while, but rest didn't last. Hunger soon clawed at her belly, sharp and insistent. She had eaten nothing since morning, and now the emptiness gnawed at her with each passing hour. Her stepmother hadn't even left her a crust of bread. Tears welled up at the cruelty of it. but she swallowed them down, determined not to let her fear consume her. By dawn, Mary Beth was weak but alive. The air was cool, and dew clung to the grasses, which she used to wet her lips. It wasn't much, but it gave her strength to rise again. She decided she had to move. Sitting still would mean certain death. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of dirt across the rolling plains. Mary Beth walked barefoot, the ground rough beneath her small feet. Her bucket, too heavy to carry, had been abandoned, but she kept the Bible and her father's hat, the two treasures she would never part with. Each step was heavy, but she whispered to herself, "Papa would want me to keep walking." As the sun climbed higher, the heat bore down once again, searing her shoulders and face. Sweat stung her eyes and her vision blurred. She searched desperately for shade, but found little more than stunted bushes and patches of tall grass. Once, she thought she saw movement, a dark shape watching from the ridge. Her heart leapt, fearing wolves or worse. But when she blinked, again the shape was gone, leaving only shimmering heat waves. Hours crawled by. At one point, Mary Beth stumbled upon a cluster of berries clinging to a bush. Her father had once warned her, "Never eat what you don't know." But hunger twisted inside her, and she plucked one with trembling fingers, rolling it on her tongue before swallowing. The taste was bitter, but it filled her belly enough to quiet the ache. Her legs ached, her lips cracked, but still she pressed on. The will to survive was stronger than her fear. Each time she thought of lying down and giving up, she saw her father's face in her memory, his gentle smile urging her onward. That evening, the prairie bathed in golden light. Mary Beth stumbled and fell to her knees, too weary to rise. Her vision swam, and she thought she saw a rider in the distance, a tall figure on horseback, cutting across the horizon. Was it real? Or was it another cruel mirage conjured by her exhausted mind? She whispered hoarsely into the empty air. "Please, don't let me die alone." Unbeknownst to her, the figure was no mirage. A rancher named Caleb Montgomery was riding the range, and his path was about to cross with hers, changing both their lives forever. Caleb Montgomery was a man used to silence. His ranch stretched far and wide across the plains, where only the lowing of cattle and the wind through the grass broke the stillness. He rode often, checking fences, scouting the herds, or simply letting his horse carry him where the land unfolded like an ocean of gold. But on that particular evening, as the sun melted low against the horizon, something stirred uneasily in his chest. He couldn't have said why, but he felt he was meant to be on the trail that day. He rode his chestnut stallion, Duke, at a steady pace, scanning the ground as habit dictated. That was when he spotted a small figure collapsed near the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, a coyote or a pile of brush. But as he drew closer, his heart tightened. It was a child. "Whoa," he murmured, pulling the reins. Duke slowed, hooves crunching against the dirt, until they stopped beside her. The girl looked no older than 9. She lay curled against the ground, dust clinging to her dress, her hair tangled and streaked with sweat. A man's hat, far too large for her head, had slipped askew, shading half her face. Caleb dismounted swiftly, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. "Miss?" His voice was low, careful, as if afraid that speaking too loud might shatter her fragile frame. Mary Beth stirred weakly, her lips cracked, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she thought the cowboy was another vision, like the shadowy shapes she had seen before when hunger and thirst blurred her sight. But this man's hand was real and steady as it lifted her gently, propping her against his arm. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, don't leave me." Caleb's throat tightened. He reached for the canteen at his belt and held it to her lips. "Easy now," he said. "Small sips." She obeyed, swallowing greedily at first, then slower as the cool water soothed her parched throat. Her small fingers clutched the canteen as if it were a lifeline. "Where's your family?" Caleb asked softly once she had drunk her fill. Mary Beth blinked up at him, eyes wide and brimming with fear. The memory of the wagon, the dust, her stepmother's hard face, it all pressed down at once. Tears welled, spilling silently down her dirt-streaked cheeks. She couldn't bring herself to answer, but the truth was plain enough. The girl had been left behind. Caleb's jaw clenched. He had seen hard things in his life, orphans, widows, men broken by the land, but something about this child's silent suffering struck deeper than any wound. He pulled a blanket from his saddlebag and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said firmly, though the words felt like a promise heavier than any he'd ever made. "I won't let anything happen to you." With careful hands, he lifted her onto his horse, settling her in front of him. She sagged against his chest, exhausted, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. Duke snorted, shifting under the new weight, but Caleb steadied the reins. As they turned back toward his ranch, the sky deepened into indigo, stars pricking through the fading light. Mary Beth clung weakly to the brim of her father's hat, the last piece of her old life, while Caleb's arm held her steady. The cowboy glanced down at the frail figure nestled against him. Something stirred in him he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, but a fierce protective resolve. Whoever had left this child to die had thrown her away, but Caleb Montgomery knew in that moment that she was no cast-off. She was someone worth saving. And as the trail carried them homeward, he began to realize that his solitary life, once so complete, had just changed forever. Caleb's ranch sat nestled in a wide valley, its pastures rolling out like a green sea dotted with grazing cattle. A weathered barn, a sturdy corral, and a farmhouse with whitewashed walls stood proudly at its heart. To most, it looked like a place of hard work. To Mary Beth, arriving in the gray hours of dawn after her rescue, it looked like a miracle. She had drifted in and out of sleep on the ride back, cradled securely against Caleb's chest, the steady rhythm of Duke's hooves lulling her weary body. But when the horse slowed and she heard the soft clucking of chickens, the lowing of cattle, and the barking of a ranch dog, her eyes fluttered open. For the first time in days, she felt the faint tug of safety. Caleb lifted her gently from the saddle and carried her into the farmhouse. The air inside was warm and smelled of coffee and fresh bread. "You'll be all right now," he murmured, as he set her down on a chair. He moved with quiet efficiency, fetching her a bowl of broth, clean water for her face, and a quilt from the upstairs bedroom. Mary Beth sat stiffly at first, clutching her father's hat in her lap as if it might vanish if she let go. She eyed the steaming bowl suspiciously, unused to kindness being offered without a cruel word. Caleb noticed her hesitation and crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Eat as much as you like," he said gently. "There's plenty here, and no one's going to take it from you." The sincerity in his voice cracked something open inside her. Tentatively, she lifted the spoon and tasted the broth. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the cold knot that had lived in her belly for days. She ate slowly at first, then with quiet urgency until the bowl was empty. Caleb refilled it without comment. In the days that followed, Mary Beth began to learn what life on the Montgomery ranch meant. At first, she was shy and silent, watching from corners as Caleb went about his work. He never pressed her with questions, never demanded explanations she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he offered small gestures of reassurance, teaching her how to collect eggs without the hens pecking, showing her which bucket was safest to drink from, leaving a plate of food on the table and pretending not to notice when she ate every scrap. The ranch hands, rough around the edges but good-hearted, took their cues from Caleb. They didn't pester her, though one, a lanky fellow named Josiah, left a little carved wooden horse by her place at the table one evening. Mary Beth said nothing, but the next day, the toy was tucked carefully into the pocket of her dress. Slowly, the color returned to her cheeks. She smiled once, just a small, fleeting curve of her lips when the ranch dog, Blue, dropped a stick at her feet and barked insistently until she threw it. Caleb, watching from the porch, felt something shift in his chest at that smile. It was fragile, like the first bloom of spring after a harsh winter. But it was there. Still, shadows lingered. At night, Mary Beth sometimes woke screaming, haunted by dreams of the wagon disappearing down the trail. Caleb would find her curled up, trembling, clutching the too large hat. He never scolded, never told her to hush. Instead, he would sit beside her bed until the storm passed, speaking softly about the stars, the horses, or the gentle way morning always comes. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mary Beth spoke for the first time of her father. Her voice was quiet, halting, but Caleb listened as if every word were a treasure. When she finished, tears in her eyes, he said simply, "He'd be proud of you, more than you know." For Mary Beth, the ranch was no longer just a stranger's home. It was a place where her hunger was met with food, her fear with safety, and her silence with patience. Piece by piece, the shattered edges of her heart began to knit together. She wasn't healed yet, not fully, but for the first time since her father's death, she believed healing was possible. The weeks on Caleb's ranch passed like a slow, gentle thaw. Mary Beth grew stronger, her cheeks no longer hollow, her eyes no longer dulled by fear. She learned to sweep the porch without being scolded, to feed the chickens without being struck, and to smile when Caleb praised her small efforts. She began to think quietly that perhaps the worst was behind her. But the past has a way of finding what tries to hide from it. It happened on a warm afternoon, the air buzzing with the hum of cicadas. Mary Beth was in the garden, carefully pulling weeds between rows of beans Caleb had planted, when a plume of dust rose on the trail leading to the ranch. She straightened, shading her eyes with her hand. A wagon creaked into view, its wooden, wheels groaning under the weight of a woman seated high on the bench. Even from a distance, Mary Beth felt her stomach twist. The rigid posture, the sharp set of the jaw, it was Lydia, her stepmother. Mary Beth's heart dropped to her feet. For a moment, she considered running, hiding in the barn or the fields until the woman left. But her legs felt rooted to the ground, trembling like a sapling in the wind. The wagon rolled to a stop before the farmhouse. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his expression calm but watchful. He had been told little of the girl's past, yet he had pieced together enough. Someone had abandoned her, someone cruel. Now standing before him was the likely culprit. Lydia climbed down from the wagon, her eyes sharp as they swept over the ranch. She spotted Mary Beth and narrowed her gaze. "There you are," she said coldly, as if the child had wandered off of her own accord. "You've caused me no end of trouble, girl. Time to come back where you belong." Mary Beth shook her head instinctively, clutching her father's hat to her chest. "No," she whispered, barely audible, but Caleb heard it. He stepped down from the porch, placing himself subtly between Lydia and the girl. "This your stepdaughter?" His voice was even, but there was a hardness beneath it. Lydia lifted her chin. "By law, yes, and I'll thank you to return her." She ran off in a fit of mischief. "I've been searching everywhere." Caleb's eyes narrowed. He had seen enough lies in his time to recognize one when it stared him in the face. He glanced at Mary Beth, who was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. That was no runaway child. This was a girl who had been cast aside. "She didn't run off," Caleb said firmly. "I found her starving on the trail. If you cared for her, she wouldn't have been in that condition." Lydia's face tightened, the smooth mask of civility slipping. "She's mine by rights, and if you think you can keep her, I'll have the law on you. Do you know who they'll believe? A rancher or a poor widow trying to get back what's hers?" Mary Beth's breath came in quick gasps. The thought of being dragged back to Lydia's cruelty made her chest ache. She took a step closer to Caleb, clutching his sleeve with small fingers. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. Caleb looked down at her, then back at Lydia. His voice dropped low, steady as stone. "I don't take kindly to folks abandoning children to die, and I don't scare easy. If you've got business with the law, bring it. But until then, this girl stays here, safe." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as thunder before a storm. Lydia's eyes flashed with fury, but she seemed to read in Caleb's stance that he would not back down. She spat a bitter word under her breath, turned sharply, and climbed back onto the wagon. The wheels groaned as she whipped the horse into motion, dust rising in her wake. Mary Beth watched until the wagon disappeared down the trail, her small body still trembling. Caleb rested a steady hand on her shoulder. "She won't hurt you again," he said, "not while I'm here." And for the first time, Mary Beth believed him. Word traveled fast in small towns. It was no surprise then that within a week of Lydia's visit to the ranch, gossip buzzed through the streets of Willow Creek. The widow Callahan was stirring up trouble, claiming her stepdaughter had been snatched by Caleb Montgomery, the wealthy rancher who lived on the edge of town. Some said it was all a misunderstanding. Others whispered that Lydia had abandoned the child. But no one spoke too loud. Lydia was cunning, and Caleb was respected. Folks knew a storm was brewing. The confrontation came on a Saturday when the townsfolk gathered at the general store. Caleb had ridden in with Mary Beth to buy her a proper pair of shoes, her first since she'd come to the ranch. She stood quietly by his side, clutching a small paper sack of penny candy he had insisted she pick out. Her eyes darted nervously, but Caleb's steady presence anchored her. The jingle of harness bells cut through the chatter as Lydia's wagon pulled up. She stepped down with a dramatic air, her black dress crisp, her expression sharpened to a knife's edge. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "There she is!" Lydia's voice rang out as she pointed an accusatory finger at Caleb. "That man's keeping my stepdaughter from me, against my will, by rights. She belongs in my care, not paraded about like a prize calf." Gasps and murmurs spread among the townsfolk. All eyes turned to Caleb. Mary Beth shrank behind him, her small hand clutching his coat. He placed a protective arm around, her shoulders drawing her close. Caleb's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of iron. "This girl isn't a prize, ma'am. She's a child, and I found her left for dead on the trail, with no food, no water, and no one to look after her. You call that care?" Lydia's face flushed. "Lies," she spat. "She ran off in a tantrum, and now he twists the truth to make me out a monster. I demand she be returned to me immediately, or I'll take the matter before the sheriff." The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Hale, had been leaning against the post outside the store, listening quietly. Now he stepped forward, his face grave. "Is that so, Caleb? Did you take this girl without consent?" Caleb met the sheriff's gaze squarely. "I took her in because she was dying. You can see for yourself the state she was in when I found her, skin and bones, scared out of her wits. That's not the mark of a runaway, Hale. That's neglect." Mary Beth, trembling, peeked out from behind Caleb's coat. Her voice wavered but carried clear enough for all to hear. "She left me," she whispered. "She told me to fetch water, and when I came back, the wagon was gone." The crowd stirred. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others shook their heads with disapproval. Lydia's eyes darted, her composure slipping as whispers of "cruel woman" and heartless rustled through the onlookers. Caleb straightened to his full height, his tone ringing with finality. I won't hand her over to someone who sees her as a burden. She deserves a home where she's wanted, where she's safe, and as long as I've got breath in me, that home will be with me. His words settled over the crowd like a gavel striking. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Sounds to me like the girl's better off where she is. Unless you've got proof otherwise, Lydia, you've no claim worth enforcing here. Lydia's face twisted with rage, but she saw the tide had turned. With the townsfolk watching, with the sheriff's word against hers, she had lost her grip. With a hiss of fury, she spun on her heel, climbed into her wagon, and drove off in a spray of dust. Mary Beth let out a shaky breath, clinging tighter to Caleb. He looked down at her and tipped his hat. It's settled, little one. You're not going back. Not ever. And in that moment, before the eyes of the whole town, Caleb's stand became more than defiance. It became a vow of guardianship. The prairie morning was crisp and golden when the final step of Mary Beth's new life began. After weeks of safety, warmth, and Caleb's steady care, the last shadow of fear began to lift. Yet for Mary Beth, the idea of fully belonging somewhere still felt fragile, like holding a soap bubble in her hands. She had survived so much that trusting happiness seemed almost dangerous. Caleb had spent the morning in town at the sheriff's office, finalizing the legal adoption. He returned with a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that no one could ever claim Mary Beth now, that her place in his life was as permanent as the hills and rivers of his ranch. When he rode through the front gate, he spotted her in the garden, carefully planting young tomato seedlings in neat rows. She looked up at the sound of his horse and smiled, a small but genuine curve of lips that reached her eyes. "Morning, little one," he called, dismounting and brushing dust from his jeans. His gaze softened as he studied her. She had grown stronger, her cheeks full of color, her posture upright and steady. No longer the trembling, abandoned girl of weeks ago, Mary Beth now carried a quiet dignity that even Caleb had not dared hope for. "Morning, Caleb," she replied, wiping her hands on her dress. She felt a flutter of pride as he crouched down to inspect her seedlings. "The tomatoes should grow well this year," she said, her voice more confident than she realized. Caleb nodded. "Just like you, growing stronger every day." His words brought a warmth to her chest, a reassurance she had longed for. He reached into his pocket and produced a small folded document, the legal papers granting him guardianship, now transformed into full adoption. "This makes it official," he said. "From today forward, you're my daughter. No one can ever take that from you." Mary Beth's fingers trembled as she took the papers. She looked up at Caleb, tears brimming but not yet falling. "Really?" she whispered, as if the words were too wonderful to believe. I'm really yours?" "Absolutely," he said firmly, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And I'll always be here for you. No one will ever hurt you again. I promise." The moment was quiet, yet it carried the weight of everything she had endured. Her father's death, Lydia's cruelty, the endless trial on the trail, and the fear that had once threatened to swallow her whole. She clutched Caleb's hand, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known before. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life filled with love, safety, and even joy. Days turned into weeks, and Mary Beth settled fully into life on the ranch. She learned to ride alongside Caleb, to care for the animals, and to take pride in the land they worked together. She laughed openly now, her voice ringing across the fields, echoing with a freedom she had never experienced. The ranch hands treated her as family, the animals responded to her gentleness, and every corner of the home felt warmer and safer than any place she had ever known. Caleb, too, changed. The once solitary rancher had found not just a child to protect, but a companion who reminded him of the simple joys of life. Morning sunlight, the thrill of first planting, the quiet comfort of shared meals. The bond between them deepened daily, each act of care reinforcing the unspoken truth that family could be chosen, built, and strengthened with love. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and pink, Mary Beth sat on the porch, her father's, hat carefully set beside her. Caleb joined her, draping an arm over her shoulders. "See that horizon?" he asked. "That's where your new life begins, every day." Mary Beth leaned against him, feeling the solid reassurance of his presence. "I think I'm ready," she whispered, ready to leave the fear behind, ready to embrace the love she had been given, ready to be Caleb's daughter in every way that mattered. And in the wide, open expanse of the prairie, with the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of a future unbound by cruelty or loss, Mary Beth finally found a place where she belonged.